The Great Ecclesiastical Conspiracy by George Davis and Michael Clark. Copyright 2002. In Search of a City, Vision Publishing. Chapter 1. How did the Greek word ecclesia, meaning a called-out assembly, come to be translated church? Why did the Greek words presbytery, the elderly, apostle, envoy or sent one, and deacon, servant, remain untranslated into their anglicized form? Why was the Greek word presbyteros, older or elderly, translated priest? Why indeed, there is little doubt that these words remained untranslated so that the clergy could redefine them, interpreting them with the strongest institutional and hierarchical connotations. Was this mere ignorance, or a means of creating a ruling class of super saints? It is clear to us that down through the years the scriptures have been subjected to papal tampering. There even remains evidence that some of the early manuscripts were altered. Quote, "But almost all authorities on the text agree that they preserve a better text than the standardized 5th century one, which shows clear signs of having been edited." Erdman's Handbook to the Bible, page 73. End quote. It is also clear that this tampering was to promote and justify a system of church government ordered after the government of the kings of the Gentiles, which Christ had strictly prohibited, saying, "But you shall not be so." See Luke 22, 25, and 26. Whatever happened to the servanthood that Jesus and the early church modeled? How did these servants of the 1st century give way to the pontiff kings of the 4th and 5th centuries? Had Christ's declaration, "But you shall not be so," been forgotten? The early believers followed the Lord's example and instructions on this all-important matter, and they viewed servanthood as the highest vocation. But by the close of the 1st century, the subtle signs of the rise of the bishops began, ever so cunningly, to corrupt the simplicity of the faith and to defile the example of the lowly Christ. As absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, so the corruption began. Like a dead corpse rotting away, in time the church bore only a vague resemblance to what was once living and vibrant. In the 3rd century, the wound worsened by the full marriage of this apostate church to paganism. This new Christianity became the imperial religion of the Roman Empire. It was there, at Constantinople, that the very first Christian temples were constructed. They were merely Christianized pagan temples. The priesthood was fashioned after a mixture of the Old Testament and pagan priesthoods. Finally, Rome had done it. If they could not add Christ to the pantheon, they would bring the pantheon to Christianity. The Romans had long since tried to further unite their empire by uniting all its gods in one temple, the pantheon. There the worship of the sun was mixed with the worship of the sun, so much so that a 3rd century mosaic from a tomb found under St. Peter's in Rome depicted Christ as the sun god in his chariot. It was not until the 5th century that the worshippers in Rome stopped bowing to the sun before entering St. Peter's Basilica. Quote, "Pope Leo I, in the middle of the 5th century, rebuked worshippers who turned around to bow to the sun before entering St. Peter's Basilica." End quote. Erdman's Handbook to the History of Christianity, page 131. The deception reigned unchecked for 925 years, until William Tyndale challenged this religious institution with the light of the truth. He revealed part of the conspiracy that had enslaved the family of God in this twisted, abnormal thing, which the Pharisaical clergy called the church. Although he revealed some of the conspiracy, changing history forever, it nonetheless remains. The light sent it scurrying into the shadows, only to return in a more subtle, congenial form, an anglicized form. It now smiled as it placed the dagger between the 4th and the 5th rib. A tame beast is still a beast, and though defanged and declawed, it can still cripple and maim. After Tyndale was martyred for his efforts, and all but 2 of his Bibles destroyed, several important events occurred. First, Henry VIII evicted the Catholic Church from England because the Pope refused to annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon and sanction his illicit relationship with Anne Boleyn. The break with Rome came in 1534, when Parliament passed the Supremacy Act, making Henry head of the Church of England. Henry was somewhat sympathetic to Luther's views, which opened England as never before to Protestant influences, including translating, printing, and importing Protestant Bibles. Some men, such as Coverdale, were inspired to continue in the spirit of Tyndale's work. There was also the Geneva Bible, which effected great changes throughout Europe. In the tradition of Tyndale, these Bibles no longer promoted the divine right of kings and ruling bishops, but instead recognized the priesthood of all believers. To kings and bishops who exercised absolute authority over the masses, this was intolerable. More than anything else, this set the stage for the translation of a new Bible. The King's New Bible was translated to solidify the station of both king and bishops, preserving and advancing a system of church government that stood in antithesis to Christ's example and teachings, and continues to do so until this very day. We believe in the inspiration and accuracy of the Koine Greek texts of the New Testament. However, the translations that have followed are not as reliable for a number of reasons, not the least of which is ecclesiastical ambition. Historically, this love letter from God that we call the Bible was shaped into a scepter of power in the hands of popes, kings, and would-be kings to further consolidate their power over the masses. Undoubtedly, this very ambition has tainted the translations from Jerome onward. This reached new heights at a time when bishops sought the approval of kings to authorize translations that had been purposefully skewed toward their ecclesiastical paradigm. It is ludicrous to many that the Protestant Church could be guilty of carrying on any of the traditions of the Catholic Church that it so loudly objected to. To some, the idea of an ongoing conspiracy is even more unbelievable because they already possess the unadulterated truth. They hold it in their hands, professing that it is the ultimate authority, the only true Bible, the authorized Bible, the King James Bible. Authorized by whom? No less than King James himself. King James did his part in preserving the conspiracy. An understanding of the political climate of the early 16th century is crucial if we're to comprehend the motives and logic behind the King's New Translation. King James was a staunch advocate of the divine right of kings, as facilitated by puppet bishops. This was the Anglican answer to papal succession, in which active resistance to pope or king was considered a sin worthy of eternal damnation. In his Basilicon Doron, in the second sonnet entitled The Argument of the Book, we catch a glimpse of James's exaggerated appraisal of kingship. Quote, God gives not kings the style of gods in vain, for on his throne his scepter do they sway, and as their subjects ought them to obey, so kings should fear and serve their God again. End quote. Using similar language in his first address to the Parliament, James defended his doctrine of the divine right of kings. He did not mince words regarding his intention to be an absolute monarch over England. He presented the following logic as grounds for his supremacy. Quote, the state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and set upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. End quote. True to his words, James dissolved Parliament, and for 10 years thereafter he ruled England without it. Considering James's overstated view of kingship and his disregard for the parliamentarian style of leadership, it is understandable that he would also have apprehensions regarding Presbyterianism. This style of church government was developed by Calvin in Geneva and had no place for kings or bishops. In his excellent book entitled In the Beginning, Alistair McGrath tells of a particular event that took place in Scotland, which shaped James' views on this matter. Quote, his views on this matter were shaped to no small extent by some unpleasant experiences with Scottish presbyteries, particularly under Andrew Melville, a Scottish Presbyterian who had taught at Geneva Academy, and formed a close personal relationship with Calvin's protege, Theodore Beza. At a heated encounter between the king and senior churchman at Falkland Place in October 1596, Melville had physically taken hold of James and accused him of being God's silly vassal. Melville pointedly declared that while they would support James as king in public, in private they all knew perfectly well that Christ was the true king of Scotland, and his kingdom was the Kirk, a kingdom in which James was a mere member, not a lord or head. James was shaken by this physical and verbal assault, not the least because it suggested that Melville and his allies posed a significant threat to the Scottish throne. End quote. In the Beginning, page 140. James also developed a dislike for the Geneva Bible, which was widely read and promoted by the Puritans. At that time it was in fact the most popular Bible in England. James's disdain for the Geneva Bible was not so much due to the translation itself, but primarily because of its marginal notes that promoted the notion that all believers comprised the New Testament priesthood, and that they, not the king, were God's anointed. James also developed a dislike for the Geneva Bible, which was widely read and promoted by the Puritans. At that time it was in fact the most popular Bible in England. James's disdain for the Geneva Bible was not so much due to the translation itself, but primarily because of its marginal notes that promoted the notion that all believers comprised the New Testament priesthood and that they, not the king, were God's anointed. The Geneva Bible notes on Psalm 105:14 and 15 read, Psalm 105:14, He suffered no man to do them wrong, yea, he reproved kings for their sakes. In the note, G, that is, the king of Egypt and the king of Gerar. Psalm 105:15, saying, Touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm. In the notes, those whom I have sanctified to be my people, meaning the old fathers to whom God showed himself plainly and who set forth his word. The anointed that should not be touched were not kings. In fact, God reproved kings for their sake. The anointed consists of all those whom God has sanctified to be his people, not a king or a special breed of ruling ministers. The Geneva Bible notes on Luke 22:24 reads, And there was also a strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest. And the note says, The pastors are not called to rule, but to serve. Gary DeMar comments further, quote, In 1620 the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth with their Bibles, and a conviction derived from those Bibles of establishing a new nation. The Bible was not the King James Version. When James I became King of England in 1603, there were two translations of the Bible in use. The Geneva Bible was the most popular, and the Bishop's Bible was used for reading in churches. End quote. King James disapproved of the Geneva Bible because of its Calvinistic leanings. He also frowned on what he considered to be seditious marginal notes on key political texts. A marginal note for Exodus 1:9 indicated that the Hebrew midwives were correct in disobeying the Egyptian king's orders, and a note for 2 Chronicles 15:16 said that King Asa should have had his mother executed and not merely deposed for the crime of worshiping an idol. The King James Version of the Bible grew out of the king's distaste for these brief but potent doctrinal commentaries. He considered the marginal notes to be a political threat to his kingdom. Quote, At a conference at Hampton Court in 1604, with bishops and theologians, the king listened to a suggestion by the Puritan scholar John Reynolds that a new translation of the Bible was needed. Because of his distaste for the Geneva Bible, James was eager for a new translation. I profess, he said, I could never yet see a Bible well translated in English, but I think that, of all, that of Geneva is the worst. End quote. The Geneva Bible, the Forgotten Translation by Gary DeMar. This helps us to better understand why the Geneva Bible was so despised by King James. It is not an overstatement to say that much of James's conduct as King of England was reactionary, done to counter an unacceptable turn toward egalitarianism. There is little doubt in our minds but that a clandestine scheme lay at the heart of James's decision to translate his new Bible. After James came to England and was crowned king, a bishop by the name of Richard Bancroft, soon to become archbishop, sought to save the church and the nation of England from the Puritan false prophets. Bancroft was aware of James's exalted view of kingship and used that knowledge to promote his own agenda. In presenting the Puritans as a threat to the crown, Bancroft solicited the king's help in suppressing this greatest threat to his position and power, and in so doing made himself the highest authority in the Church of England, second only to the king himself. There can be little doubt but that the true motive behind Bancroft's intrigue was a desire to preserve the power of the unbiblical bishopric. Alistair McGrath explains Bancroft's strategy. Quote, Bancroft's strategy for coping with James was simple. He would persuade James that the monarchy was dependent upon the episcopacy. Without bishops there was no future for the monarchy in England. End quote. In the beginning, page 152. This political cunning played a significant role in the decision to translate a new Bible, an authorized version that would make all other versions unauthorized. From all appearances, the new translation was a calculated initial step toward ridding England of the despised Geneva Bible and its marginal notes. This new Bible would preserve and promote the divine right of kings and bishops to rule. Bishop Bancroft was placed in charge of the translation. This move was akin to a CEO entrusting the company finances to a known embezzler. There is little doubt that Bancroft stacked the translation panel with a goodly number of translators who shared his views. Mr. McGrath explains, quote, A further point that helped win Bancroft over to the new translation was that he was able to secure for himself a leading personal role in selecting the translators, and then in limiting their freedom. Bancroft had realized that it was better to create a new official translation that he could influence than to have to contend with the authorization of the Geneva Bible. It was decidedly the lesser of two evils. He was in a position to exercise considerable influence over the new Bible by laying rules of translation that would ensure that it would be sympathetic to the position and sensitivities of the established Church of England. And finally, he would be in a position to review the final text of the translation in case it needed any judicious changes before publication." End quote. In the beginning, page 164. Determined to ensure that the translation process was prudently guided, Bancroft limited the freedom of the translators by drafting 15 rules of translation, which were approved by King James. 2 of these rules are of special importance. Number 1. The ordinary Bible read in the church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, was to be followed and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. Number 3. The old ecclesiastical words were to be kept, vis-a-vis the word church not to be translated congregation. The Bishop's Bible was a revision of the Great Bible, which was expressly translated in hopes of replacing the Geneva Bible. Archbishop Matthew Parker commissioned this revision. A company of bishops did the translating, thus the name the Bishop's Bible. Archbishop Parker faced considerable opposition from the Puritans for his insistence upon the use of robes and his writings that held to the old line. Ironically, the Bishop's Bible, which until that time had been ineffective in accomplishing its original purpose of replacing the Geneva Bible, would now, in the hands of another ambitious bishop, be used to that very end. In order to preserve their precious power base, King James and Bishop Bancroft took a giant step backwards in order to negate the Tyndale, Coverdale, and Geneva Bibles. Rule number 3 was clearly designed to ensure that Tyndale's translation of the Greek word ecclesia as congregation instead of church would not be used in the King's New Bible. Tyndale had translated the Greek word ecclesia as congregation and revealed his contempt for the word church by using the word churches in Acts 19:37 to refer to heathen temples. Could he have been trying to tell us something? Clearly, an accurate translation was not the objective of Bancroft and his team. As if that were not enough, when the translation was complete, Bancroft took the final draft into his home and further altered it before giving it over to the king to be published. Alister McGrath explains, quote, "Having completed the recommendations for revision of the work of the translators of the King's New Bible, the text was passed on to Miles Smith and Thomas Bilson, who were charged with the adding of the finishing touches. It is not clear whether their role was to review the overall text of the translation or simply to comment on the specific changes proposed by the editorial committee that had met at Stationers' Hall. Then, in an apparently unscripted development, Richard Bancroft reviewed what had been hitherto regarded as the final version of the text. It would be one of his final acts. Bancroft died on November 2nd, 1610, and never lived to see the translation over which he had held so much sway, by order of the king. Smith complained loudly to anyone who would listen that Bancroft had introduced 14 changes in the final text without any consultation. Yet we remain unclear to what those alleged changes might have been." End quote. In the beginning, page 188. This is only a sample of the kind of political jockeying that was going on behind the scenes and the ambition that sponsored the translating, editing, and publication of the King's New Bible, which could not escape being tainted by such ambition. King James prohibited his translators from removing the old ecclesiastical words that had taken generations to weave into the text. He had to make a special emphasis in order to keep them, since any honest translator would have translated them out. Bancroft and King James intended to keep them no matter what the translators discovered. Quote, "I am convinced that the King James translators, laboring under an institutional church mentality, selected the strongest words possible which conveyed the idea that the people must submit to the authority of the clergy. In this way, King James could control the people through the church, of which he was supreme ruler." End quote. Dusty Owens, quote taken from "It Shall Not Be So Among You" by Norman Park.